And again, we're back. Casey Green, we're here at the ASU GSV Innovation Conference. My conversation for the next 15, 18 minutes is going to be with Matt Pittinsky. Matt is the CEO of Parchment. I'll give him a chance to explain that. He has a really interesting background. He was one of the founders of Blackboard, was affiliated with Blackboard as its chairman, and went on to go get a doctorate in education and have a faculty position at ASU as an tenure track faculty member, and then got brought back to the other side. He's now with Parchment. So we'll talk with Matt about some of his current activities with Parchment, but really the conversation is going to focus about the issue of being an entrepreneur in education and trying somebody who's gone in and out, sort of both sides of it. Okay, that work?
Yeah.
So Matt, your moment of shameless self-promotion. Tell us about Parchment.
Well, I do love talking about Parchment. So Parchment is a digital credentials service. So if you think about the transcripts and certificates and diplomas that you earn in your academic life, today they're very analog, they're paper-based, the data are trapped, they're opaque. The typical transcript just provides courses and credit information. And so our focus is really on moving credentials to digital. And once they're digital, really innovating that credential to communicate competency information or experiential information. And the key of it really is the learner, the ability for you or I to be able to go to one service and collect and manage our official, verified, certified academic credentials, stack them, and then begin to bring in professional credentials, personal credentials. You know, our hope, our vision, what we're working towards is a world in which all of the credentials that you earn are available digitally, and Parchment can be that profile that allows you to actively manage them and put them to work.
So a lot of the focus, though, if I understand this correctly, was helping high schools get transcripts to colleges initially. Is that right?
So that was the beginning.
Right.
We focused on high school to college, and now we've built out a lot of colleges sending to employers and licensing boards.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just the official transcript in terms of an institutional device, but it also allows me then to also enter my own data as a complement and supplement to whatever the official document might be from the institution.
Not exactly. I mean, we do have a profile,
Right.
and so in the profile you can add additional elements. But one of the things that we focus a lot on is these are the true, valid, certified credentials from the institution. There's no other way to get things onto Parchment. You can't upload, a copy or a picture of your diploma or transcript. Everything that's on Parchment comes through a trusted relationship from our network. We have now about 26% of high school enrollments are at schools that are live and actively using Parchment. About 16% of college enrollments are at schools that are live and actively using Parchment. That's the good news. The bad news is if you're not one of those enrollments or alums, then Parchment isn't as useful to you. You can't get your digital credentials.
Well, let's talk about the stuff beyond the obvious institutional stuff. My high school transcript going to a college.
Yes.
So, for example, say I'm a high school student and I've enrolled in a MOOC, or I've got some sort of other external certification, which you said Parchment incorporates. How do I get that in? Because that doesn't come from my high school.
Right. So, the focus of the business, and we've been around, we made some progress. We still have a long way to go. The focus of our business, first and foremost, is network reach.
Right.
So we started with just high schools and just their transcripts. Now we do their certificates, diplomas, as well as transcripts. We then moved on to universities. We started with transcripts, then certificates, then diplomas. Along the way, we built out an interface for the receiving or verifying side of the credential so they can collect and process it. And we're now moving into online providers, continuing in exec ed, professional. So it's a horrible analogy, but it's a little bit like OpenTable. Early on, not every restaurant was on it.
Right.
And it was only as useful as whether you were in an area where there were a critical mass. Parchment's network is growing and growing. So today, unfortunately, the use case you're describing, we wouldn't be able to support the stacking of credentials from non-Parchment members. But we're working pretty hard to solve that by continuing to expand that network reach.
So extending the network, who are some of the sort of the non-traditional sources of certification that might be part of it? MOOCs would be one example, perhaps not.
Sure.
Not one that's there. Red Cross certification, other kinds of things that students might accumulate in high school or in college.
So we began with a focus on the academic market.
Right.
So we're fortunate in terms of our K-12 presence. Universities span from American Public University to Stanford to Columbia and Cornell, really a great city colleges of Chicago, a really nice network. We work with the Collegiate Learning Assessment and CAE, which is the issuer of the Collegiate Learning Assessment. We're the platform for the GED and the GED assessment and diplomas. There are some associations that are doing digital certificates through Parchment as well. So I would say the heart of our network is still academe. And where we are, particularly this year, is beginning to expand into those new types of credentialing markets.
Got a question from our audience concerned about privacy and personal security. Obviously, in terms of whenever third parties are involved in moving documents, information from one place to the next. In other words, a school presumably uses you as the transmission vehicle, perhaps you're a storage vehicle the same way.
That is at the heart of what we do. It's the security and the trust, and we're evaluated by state education agencies who adopt us and by the individual institutions. So there's a FERPA consent process. The university who's a member really sets the policies for how they validate a student's identity, that our platform helps enable that process. And then when we deliver a credential, it's only if you decide that you want to keep a copy in your credential profile that we begin to build that profile. Otherwise, it is more of a delivery or exchange experience, as opposed to, we're not building a big database of credentials. We don't look into the content of those credentials. Again, unless you've said, I want to hold on to these credentials, I want to collect them and manage them, in which case then we could begin to use them to do various types of analytics, as well as deliver them, share them on LinkedIn or Facebook, but it really puts you in control of those credentials.
I want to shift our conversation a bit, Matt. So this is the Innovation Conference. There are a lot of folks here who are aspiring, some actual education entrepreneurs. You've done this is your second time in that seat in terms of one of the founders of Blackboard. Went off and got an academic credential, started on an academic career at ASU in a tenure track faculty position, and you're now on the outside again. I know you have an affiliation with ASU as a faculty involvement, but your day job, and probably a good part of your nighttime as well, is taken up with your responsibilities with Parchment. For those who want to do what you have done in terms of be part of bringing a new technology, a new resource, a new way of doing things into K-12 or higher ed, what are some of the critical things to think about? But, looking back, both in terms of the early Blackboard experience and the Parchment experience, what are the 3 or 4 things you wish you had done better or had done differently?
That's a great question. I mean, first off, Parchment feels just like Blackboard, except I'm not 24 years old. I'm married and I have 3 children, an 8-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 3-year-old. But other than that, it's just the same, which is to say it's completely different.
Okay.
I'm very tired. But looking back, I think the experience of, first off, the importance of having a talented team, which I know sounds like a cliche, but especially in the education market, you want a group of people who not only have the passion for education, because you need that as the drive, but look, when you're an early stage company, you need people who know how to take the hill. Education can be difficult as a market to kind of penetrate. You need really aggressive, people who are passionate about education. I call it kind of radical incrementalists. They have to have a passion for kind of transforming things, but also understand that in education, A very rarely goes straight to D. Usually A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D. We usually think things are going to happen much quicker than they will. So the first is, that focus on a talented team. And related to that, I've really come to appreciate the experience of working with people who really understand the educational system. And so, especially here at GSV, there are so many companies, especially this year relative to last year, who are back to business models that are focused on schools or universities adopting things. And if that's your focus, really take the time to find the people who have worked in prior generations of categories of software, like learning management systems, who really understand who has budget, who doesn't have budget, what's the role of the provost, why does that matter, and really can help you navigate not just selling to an institution, because an institution is really a confederation of things, as you know better than I.
A lot of things and a lot of people and a lot of committees.
Right, who can really help navigate to get to that core piece of it. So I think it's the talented team that has a passion, recognizing that it's not going to happen quickly, building your business plan, your business model around a radical idea, but that is founded on a core set of problems that you're solving that can give you a sustainable model, and also the value of an experienced team that has already helped proliferate a product category into the education market.
One of the things that I've seen with young teams who bring great energy and bring great passion is that they often don't understand that they are not their client. Mm-hmm. There may have been some experience that was the catalyst to say, we can do this better. But ultimately, if you look at the larger part of the K-12 or the higher education market, they're really designing, they're building, they're hoping for success in a world that's very different than the one that they may have personally experienced as a high school student or a college student. How do you get beyond, if you will, the myopia, oh, this was my experience and therefore that must be universal, when often it's not?
Well, first off, I could not agree with you more. I mean, it's almost obvious to say it, but each of us are, statistically speaking, our particular educational experience is very, very distinct, and it's not generalizable. That's true in terms of the mix of 18 to 21-year-olds who are on campus that are a very small percentage of total enrollments. It's true in so many different ways. The thing that always amazes me is we think about universities. Degree major matters more than the university. You can have an incredibly different experience even at the same institution. So I think it is, really, it's sort of the on-ramp is what I call it. There's usually a chicken and the egg. The chicken and the egg problem is I can't really begin to get traction without capital. I can't get capital without some level of traction. One of the nice things about education relative to maybe, I don't know, selling to the Fortune 500 or the financial industry is, there's schools and universities everywhere. They're relatively open places. You probably have a relationship with one that you were part of. And so you can begin to get teachers to start using something, faculty to start using something, and you can begin to validate it and sort of evolve from there. So I think the key is just to have, first off, that awareness, to step back and really not just have a passion for education, but learn it, which again comes back to connecting yourself to experienced people. But it's also to validate, to take an incremental on-ramp approach to learning more about the problem you're trying to solve.
This is a conference about innovation. There's a lot of conversation here about evidence, metrics of success. Yet so much of what we do in education, I've said in a number of the other interviews, is driven by epiphany and opinion as opposed to evidence in terms of showing that something actually works. How important is evidence in the presentation? Think about learning. Let me even go back to your career. Learning management systems were, I think it's fair to say, a way to get stuff on the web for those of us who couldn't do HTML. Okay. And yet, in the emergence of learning management systems in the late 1990s, 2000, the underlying question was, does the LMS affect student learning outcomes? Maybe, maybe not. We had lots of assumptions, lots of inferences, not a lot of good data, not a lot of well-designed studies. And ultimately, I think when we finally got some large ones, we saw that in fact it wasn't so much the learning management system; it was a vehicle for delivering opportunities for time on task. It wasn't the LMS and whatever the user interface was on one application versus another. What do you do about the presentation of evidence in this context? Because campuses are risk averse; they act out of enlightened self-interest, as do faculty and teachers.
Right. So first, evidence, education technology is broad-based. Systems like Parchment, for example, our evidence would be the operational efficiency, the return on investment.
That was fairly linear.
That's much more straightforward. Right. Obviously, it's motherhood and apple pie. I'm not going to argue against the importance of instructional technology being evidence-based, but what I would observe is, I think companies lead with their chin if they make that too much of a focus. And the reason why is these are under what conditions type questions. They're not necessarily questions around the thing itself, it's questions under what conditions. And so I do think that's very important because it's the responsibility of a learning technology provider to understand those conditions. You can't bring a technology into the classroom. There's no conception of teacher training. There's no conception of the ergonomics of a teacher's day, and then say, oh, well, yeah, but that didn't work, but that's not the product, it's the teachers and the schools, and they kind of messed it up. So that evidence is important, but I would say it's under what conditions type questions. Whereas I think oftentimes the evidence-based view of the world is more, does this work? Like as if it's a monolithic, consistent, homogeneous intervention, when that's just not how education works. The same learning applications, and adopted in very different contexts will have very different outcomes. So I think it's important we understand it's an under what condition question. I think it's important to answer those questions. I think it's important, it's the responsibility of the institution, and you lead with your chin if you focus on a linear notion of efficacy to the solution as if it's a vitamin that's going to increase your I don't know, vitamin C in your blood. Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that example, because that's not how education technology, there's too many mediating factors. And if you make your brand about the end result and you lose sight of all of those mediating factors, I think you're leading with your chin.
Let's talk about exactly some of those factors, and that's the teacher, the faculty factor. There's a lot of the presentations here from startups and even companies that have been around for several years and companies that have been doing business for decades that are bringing new technologies forward. very much focused on serving faculty or serving students. And yet, and you alluded to a few moments ago about the issue of training.
Right.
It's not just a matter of bringing this forward, but also that training is an essential part of that infrastructure for products that are designed for end users, whether they're students or faculty. Talk with us a few moments about how critical is that, as opposed to just the delivery.
It's just so critical. It's so critical. And when you talk about how, I think the way you framed it is, the typical entrepreneur has their particular educational history and then thinks of education. It's sort of like touching the elephant.
Everybody's like me, and I want to touch my part.
And you're touching it and you think it's like that. Related to that is the ability to empathize or put yourself in the shoes of the end user, whether that's a school counselor, faculty member, etc. I cannot overstate, the ergonomics of being a teacher, the ergonomics of being a counselor, the pace of your day, the amount of free time that you might actually have to learn a new technology or to begin to adopt it, the dependence you then create on it if it's not performant. These are fundamental factors that I think a lot of entrepreneurs just stay one level higher and don't really go into the weeds to understand. And, training is at the center of that. Yeah. A learning management system is only as good as the faculty member who puts it to work. And yet the typical faculty member is just given an email that says, congratulations, Social 101 now has a course site. Go in and start doing things with it. And yeah, there are pull opportunities, that I could go and get training or do other things, but that's just not the incentive structure for most faculty. So training is so central, and I would say it is still probably one of the least invested and appreciated parts of bringing products to market.
Well, let's hope other entrepreneurs as well as the campus folks and the school folks are listening to that part, at least that part of our conversation. Thanks for joining us, Matt. Again, Matthew Pittinsky, who's the CEO of Parchment, also a research professor, assistant research professor at Arizona State University. And we're going to be right back. Our next conversation was with Ron Reed, who's the executive producer of South by Southwest.